The horizon bleeds pale light. It is September 48 BC, and the waters off the Egyptian coast glimmer with that strange metallic calm that comes before disaster. The air itself feels heavy, as if it carries the last breath of something vast and dying. The Mediterranean lies quiet, too quiet, as though it knows the man it carries has outlived the favor of the gods. You stand on the deck beside him. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. Pompey the Great. Once his name commanded legions. Once his victories stretched from the burning sands of Africa to the snow-cloaked peaks of Armenia. Once he returned to Rome a hero, his chariot showered in gold and laurels, his enemies paraded in chains. But the man before you now is no conqueror. His cloak, shredded by wind and salt, hangs loosely around his shoulders. His hair, once bright as bronze, is streaked with ash and gray. His eyes, once sharp enough to command the known world, stare out into the nothingness ahead, hollow and unblinking. He does not speak. He no longer needs to. The silence of defeat clings to him like another garment. His face bears the stillness of a man who has seen his world undone not by foreign blades, but by Roman ones. Behind him, the ship creaks as soldiers, what remains of them, huddle near the stern, whispering in Latin too quiet for the wind to steal. You can smell their fear. It mingles with the stench of sweat, brine, and despair. The sails hang limp above them, mottled with sea stains and tears. The flag that once bore his emblem, the crimson wolf of the Republic, flaps weakly as though reluctant to remind him of what he's lost. In the distance, the Egyptian coastline emerges, a pale line of sand shimmering in the morning haze. Palm trees sway like shadows against the rising sun, and behind them lies Alexandria, the city of pharaohs, philosophers, and now uncertain refuge. The waves glitter with deceptive warmth, but the sea carries a scent of decay, salt, seaweed, and something else. Something human. Pompey closes his eyes, his hands clasped before him as though in silent prayer. He has crossed this sea before, triumphant, leading fleets that obeyed his will. But today the water feels colder. The gods are silent. Even the oarsmen avoid his gaze. You watch him draw a deep breath and it sounds like surrender. He whispers to no one in particular, perhaps to the sea itself, "Fortune, you have made me your enemy." The words vanish in the wind. Every empire dies twice. Once on the battlefield and once in the heart of the man who built it. Behind you a sailor coughs, the sound breaking the spell of stillness. The wind shifts. Somewhere far off, thunder murmurs over the horizon. The gulls cry louder now, as if warning the ship of what waits beyond the shore. The Egyptian coast draws nearer, golden under the burning sun. The banners of Ptolemy 13 flutter faintly above the dunes, their colors bright, their purpose unclear. Refuge or trap, no one aboard can tell. Pompey's advisors murmur of hospitality, of old alliances, of kings indebted to the conqueror of the East. But the air feels wrong. You can taste it, a bitterness at the back of your throat like rusted metal. Pompey turns once more toward the sea. His gaze drifts beyond the horizon, to where the memory of Pharsalus still burns. You can almost see it reflected in his eyes, the chaos of that field, the dust and blood, the thunder of collapsing legions. His legions. The sound of Caesar's victory still echoes in his ears, louder than the crash of these waves. He grips the railing, the veins in his hands rising like the maps of old campaigns. The salt air bites his wounds. He does not wince. The sea, indifferent, carries him onward. Its waves rise and fall with the slow rhythm of fate, calm, eternal, merciless. The same waters that once bore his fleets to glory now ferry him toward betrayal. And as the ship cuts closer to the Egyptian sands, the truth hangs in the air like storm clouds. The gods do not kill their favorites in battle. They let them live long enough to watch themselves fade. If you can watch a hero beg the world he once ruled for mercy and feel nothing, then perhaps Rome's cruelty lives on in you. Subscribe to Tale of History, or turn away as his soldiers did. Before the sea carried him to exile, before the silence of defeat filled his lungs, Pompey the Great had ruled the world like a god among men. To understand his fall, you must first see him as he was, not a fugitive but a titan. The story begins decades earlier when the Republic still believed itself eternal. The air of Rome was thick with ambition, the scent of marble and sweat and smoke rising from the Senate's columns. And through its gates rode a man not born of noble blood, but made noble by victory. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. The title Magnus, the Great, bestowed upon him not by birthright but by awe. You can see him now. A young general in the dust of Africa, the sun glinting off his armor, his soldiers chanting his name with voices that shook the earth. His campaigns blazed from Spain to Asia, from Numidia to Armenia. He fought kings and pirates, rebels and tyrants, and each time the Republic bowed deeper before him. He was the man who tamed the sea. The man who made the Mediterranean safe for Rome again. The man whose shadow stretched from the Tiber to the edge of the known world. When he returned to the city after the Eastern campaigns, the triumph was unlike any before it. The streets of Rome overflowed with people. Senators in their robes, slaves in their chains, citizens pressed shoulder to shoulder just to glimpse him. They came not to celebrate a victory, but to worship the man who seemed to command the favor of every god. Gold from Asia glittered in the sunlight, wagons overflowing with treasures of conquered empires. Captured kings walked barefoot before his chariot, their crowns lowered in surrender. The roar of the crowd swallowed the sound of the trumpets. Mothers lifted their children onto rooftops, shouting, "Pompeius Magnus, the savior of Rome." The Republic had never looked so proud, nor so fragile. Because behind the laurels and banners, beneath the thunder of applause, something darker stirred, that familiar Roman poison, envy. In the Senate halls, whispers followed him. Too young, they said. Too powerful. Too beloved. He smiled, perhaps knowing that the same voices who crowned him would one day crave his blood. For in Rome, glory was not a gift. It was a sentence. Still, for a time his star burned brightest. He shared power with two men who would shape his fate, Julius Caesar and Marcus Crassus. The first triumvirate, the uneasy trinity that ruled the Republic not by law but by will. Caesar, the cunning visionary. Crassus, the master of coin. Pompey, the sword of the people. Together they divided the world, yet none could trust the others for long. But fate, ever cruel, offered a brief illusion of peace. Pompey married Julia, Caesar's daughter, a union not of love, but of politics made tender by chance. For she softened him. She called him gentle, though the world called him conqueror. Her laughter tempered his pride, her presence stilled the restlessness of his heart. For a few short years Rome knew balance. The Republic breathed. The gods smiled. Then Julia died. And with her, the fragile thread that held the world together snapped. The alliance dissolved into suspicion. The triumvirate fractured like glass beneath a hammer. Crassus, greedy for glory, perished in the sands of Parthia, his ambition swallowed by a desert and a spear. Caesar returned from Gaul crowned by victory, his legions loyal not to the Senate but to him alone. And Pompey, left behind in Rome, began to fade, not in name but in trust. He still sat in the Senate, still wore his triumphal robes, still spoke as a guardian of the Republic. But when he spoke, the room no longer listened as it once did. Men nodded, not from respect but from fear of his past. His triumphs became chains, his greatness a weight. The Republic he had defended began to turn against itself. The same senators who once hailed him as the shield of Rome now whispered that he was its tyrant. And the man who had once commanded entire continents began to feel the chill of isolation. At night, he would walk the marble corridors of his villa on the Palatine Hill, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The statues of God seemed to watch him in silence. Jupiter, Mars, Neptune, cold, expressionless, unmoved. He had built temples for them. He had given them victory after victory. But the gods do not love men who rival them. He had ascended too high. Now the descent had begun. Beyond the walls of Rome, storms gathered. Caesar's name was whispered by soldiers, merchants, and slaves alike, a name that inspired both hope and fear. Pompey saw it too late. The Republic was no longer ruled by the Senate, but by the myth of Caesar. In his dreams, he would hear again the sound of the crowds that once roared his name. But when he reached out to them, they turned away. Glory is the cruelest mistress, she never stays long. And though he did not yet know it, the road that began in triumph would end not in Rome, but on a foreign shore, where gulls screamed and waves beat against a boat that carried his doom. Every empire raises its idols only to watch them drown. If you can feel the weight of his rise and not sense the tremor of his fall, then you've never stood close enough to power to hear it crack. Subscribe to Tale of History, and remember, the gods never forgive ambition that dares to mirror their own. The year was dying, and with it, the last light of balance. Julia was gone, the only thread that had kept the ambitions of men from tearing Rome apart. Her death was not just the loss of a wife or daughter, it was the extinguishing of the fragile peace that had held three giants in check. The city mourned her quietly, but Pompey mourned her as a man who knew that love had been his last defense against destiny. In the months that followed, the air of Rome thickened. It was not yet war, but it smelled of it, that strange scent of fear disguised as patriotism, of alliances turning sour, of marble sweating under the weight of deceit. The forum, once filled with orators and philosophers, now became a stage for conspirators and cowards. And at the heart of it all stood Pompey the Great. He still carried himself with the calm authority of a man accustomed to command, but beneath the calm, the tremor had begun. His friendship with Julius Caesar, forged in the fires of ambition, began to splinter under the strain of power. The two men who once clasped hands in alliance now measured each other in silence. Every letter, every messenger, every victory weighed like a threat. In the Senate chambers, the marble floor echoed with whispers, the whispers of betrayal, of shifting loyalties, of a republic turning in upon itself. Senators gathered in corners, their togas drawn close as though secrecy itself could protect them. The pillars of the Curia seemed to lean inward, listening. Pompey had once commanded their respect, now he commanded their fear. Caesar had once been his ally, now he was the shadow on the horizon. The Senate, that ancient body of laws and honor, became a weapon. Its decrees no longer spoke for Rome, but for those who sought to survive her decay. Men who once praised Caesar's genius now accused him of tyranny. Men who had sworn loyalty to Pompey whispered of his jealousy, his vanity, his hunger for control. Pompey heard it all. He sat at the center of the storm, his hands folded, his face unmoving, but his silence was a war in itself. The halls of the Senate became theaters of performance. Speeches bled into accusations, and the word republic began to lose its meaning. It was no longer an ideal, it was a shield, a justification, a mask for power. At night, when the torches burned low and the echoes of argument faded into darkness, Pompey would walk the empty forum. The statues of the old heroes, Scipio, Cato, Brutus, watched him from their marble pedestals. Their eyes were blind, yet their judgment was heavy. He had once believed that Rome was eternal, that its glory could outlast the whims of men. But now even the gods seemed to turn their gaze elsewhere. The sky over the city glowed a strange color, as though fire already smoldered beyond the horizon. The death of Julia had done more than break a marriage, it had broken the fragile symmetry of power. Caesar, far away in Gaul, sent letters that arrived like lightning, quick, dazzling, and destructive. His victories filled the streets with rumor. Every dispatch spoke of loyalty, of discipline, of triumph. But between the lines, Pompey could hear it, the rising heartbeat of a man who would not return as an equal but as a master. Pompey responded as Rome had taught him, with calculation, not emotion. He aligned himself with the Senate, believing still in the illusion of order. They flattered him, naming him consul without colleague, a title that sounded like authority but reeked of manipulation. They needed him, not as a savior but as a shield against Caesar's advance. And so Pompey, the greatest general of the Republic, became its symbol of fear. The Senate halls grew darker with each passing session. The marble cracked under the weight of boots and secrets. Outside the people starved, inside they debated. Every speech carried the stench of moral decay. The word virtue was spoken often, too often, as though repeating it might summon its ghost. The Republic was no longer a living thing. It was a corpse dressed in ceremony. Pompey still believed he was defending it, but the Republic no longer believed in him. Some nights, he would stand on the balcony of his home, overlooking the flickering lamps of the city. Rome looked peaceful from above, a sea of quiet light, but in the distance he could hear the faint murmur of the mob, the restlessness of a people who no longer understood what they were dying for. The Senate, the people, the generals, all playing their parts in a tragedy too vast to stop. Each man convinced that history would remember him as savior, not executioner. But history remembers none as innocent. The rift between Pompey and Caesar widened until it became a chasm. And across that divide the Republic began to slip, its laws, its ideals, its gods, all tumbling into the dark. What began as politics had become something far older, the hunger of men for dominion, the lust for legacy that outlives the body. Rome was no longer a republic. It was a beast, devouring itself to feed its own illusion of greatness. Pompey, once master of the seas, now drifted on a tide he could not control. He mistook the Senate's praise for loyalty, their flattery for friendship. But the Senate was already dying, and it would drag him down with it. Every empire ends the same way, by devouring its own ideals. Subscribe to Tale of History before history devours yours. It began in winter, a season of stillness when even Rome seemed to hold its breath. But on the northern frontier, beneath skies bruised with storm, something stirred. The river called the Rubicon ran red beneath the dawn, its waters cold and unyielding, its crossing forbidden by every law the Republic had ever written. And yet, on that frozen morning of January 49 BC, a single step shattered centuries of order. You hear it, the sound of boots striking mud, the clatter of armor, the murmur of soldiers too loyal to hesitate. Then above the wind, a voice. The die is cast. Caesar had crossed. That step was no march of conquest, it was an act of rebellion. With one movement, he turned loyalty into treason, friendship into war, and the republic into prey. The Rubicon was shallow, but its waters carried the weight of destiny. On the far shore, the fate of every Roman trembled like a flame in wind. In Rome, panic spread faster than news. Messengers galloped through the gates, their horses slick with sweat, their words falling like thunder. Caesar comes. The Senate's marble corridors erupted into chaos. Sandals slapped against the floors, scrolls spilled from trembling hands, and men who had spent their lives debating virtue now fought for escape. The air inside the curia was thick with smoke and fear, the scent of melting wax from torches held too close to parchment. Decrees, oaths, and alliances went up in flame. You can see them, senators clawing at one another in the half-dark, their white togas trailing ash across the floor, each shouting the same question with different words. What will Pompey do? Pompey the Great, the sword of Rome, the savior of the Republic, the man who had once been called second only to Alexander, stood at the center of the storm he could not control. The Senate turned to him as if he were still that unbreakable figure from another age. They begged him to protect the Republic from the very man he had once called brother. He assured them he could. He told them Caesar would fall within weeks, that the legions of the Republic would rally behind him, that fortune favored the lawful. He said these things not because he believed them but because Rome needed to hear them. Outside the city shuddered. Smoke from torches coiled around the forum's pillars, banners ripped in the cold wind. The great bronze doors of the Senate clanged shut, their sound echoing like a death knell. The night sky glowed faintly with the orange light of burning scrolls, edicts of loyalty, erased by fear. Rome, the eternal city, had begun to devour itself. Pompey gathered what forces he could. His lieutenants pleaded for decisive action, to march north to meet Caesar before he reached the city. But Pompey hesitated. He knew Caesar's brilliance. He knew that behind the banner of rebellion moved not a reckless general, but a strategist who turned every defeat into destiny. And somewhere within, Pompey felt the tremor of doubt, that cold whisper that comes when a man senses history turning against him. He stood upon the steps of the Curia that night, his cloak whipping in the wind, the torches flickering across his face. Below him, the streets boiled with confusion, citizens shouting, carts overturning, families clutching what they could carry. Statues of gods looked down through the smoke, their faces smeared with soot and indifference. Pompey looked north, toward the unseen river that had divided not just armies but faith. He could almost hear it, the sound of the Rubicon's waters still breaking against Caesar's boots, the echo of that forbidden step reaching across the miles like a curse. Behind him, the Senate's voices rose again, desperate, panicked. "Command us, Magnus. Tell us what to do." And for the first time in his life, Pompey gave an order born not of victory but of fear. He told them to leave Rome. The man who had once commanded all of Rome, the man who had filled her streets with triumphal parades and his name with legend, now ordered retreat. The decision was not cowardice, it was survival. He believed he could rebuild his strength in the south, gather the legions of loyal provinces, strike back on his own terms. But in that single act, in the quiet admission that Rome was no longer his, the Republic itself began to fade. The city emptied. Senators fled with their families and treasures. The great villas along the Tiber fell dark, their braziers extinguished. The marble courtyards that had echoed with laughter now echoed with footsteps and the rustle of cloaks. In the forum, scrolls still burned, their ashes rising into the night like black snow. Torches flared, sputtered, and died one by one. The sound of sandals on marble faded, leaving behind a silence that felt like mourning. When Pompey departed through the city gates, he did not look back. He could not bear to see the skyline of Rome glowing faintly behind him. His Rome, the Rome he had served and loved and believed he had saved, now abandoned to the man who had crossed the forbidden river. Above the city, dawn began to rise, casting pale light across the smoldering ruins of parchment and pride. The Senate was gone. The Republic had no voice. And somewhere beyond the northern hills, Caesar marched steadily toward the heart of the world. Pompey rode in silence, his breath clouding in the cold air. Every hoofbeat sounded like the tick of an unseen clock. He told himself that the gods would not allow a traitor to rule, that Rome's justice would prevail, that his time would come again. But deep down, beneath the armor and titles and reason, he knew. The Rubicon was not a river. It was a point of no return. Every empire ends not in the clash of swords, but in the quiet step of a man who dares to cross a line. Every empire ends the same way, by devouring its own ideals. Subscribe to Tale of History before history devours yours. Thessaly, August 48 BC. The morning broke red as if the sun itself bled for what was about to come. The air hung heavy with dust, the kind that clings to sweat and armor and memory. Across the plain of Pharsalus, two armies faced one another in silence. Roman against Roman, brother against brother, the Republic staring into its own reflection. On one side, Pompey the Great, once master of the known world. On the other, Julius Caesar, his former ally turned shadow. Between them stretched a field of trampled earth and dying grass, a graveyard waiting to happen. You could hear everything: the muted creak of leather straps, the snort of horses, the distant flutter of banners that had once flown together under the same eagle. The soldiers of Pompey's army, men who had marched beneath his command since their youth, shifted uneasily. They had believed in him, in his victories, his discipline, his legend. But legends fade quickly when the wind smells of blood. Pompey rode slowly down the line, his horse's hooves stirring up the ancient soil. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed the tremor beneath. He had commanded hundreds of thousands before, faced kings, pirates, and nations, but never this, never Rome itself. Across the plain, Caesar stood in his crimson cloak, the wind cutting through his ranks like an omen. He watched Pompey's army through narrowed eyes, not as enemies but as ghosts of a republic already dead. The silence between them stretched until it broke under the crack of a single horn. Then the world moved. The ground shook beneath 10,000 feet. The dust rose in choking clouds. The clash of steel tore the sky apart. The cries of the dying mingled with the thunder of hooves and the whine of arrows. It was not a battle, it was a collapse. The sun disappeared behind the smoke, and for hours, neither man could see the other. Only the sound of slaughter marked time. The air grew thick with ash and the copper taste of blood. Shields splintered. Standards fell. The field became mud, red and slick beneath the weight of Rome's ambition. Pompey watched it unravel. He had positioned his forces with precision, cavalry on the wings, infantry in dense formation, confident that discipline would triumph over desperation. But Caesar's veterans moved with the cold efficiency of men who had bled too long to fear death. Every line Pompey drew, Caesar broke. Every maneuver he devised, Caesar anticipated. And then it happened, a shift, small and silent but fatal. Pompey's cavalry faltered. The left flank collapsed. The enemy surged forward like a tide breaking through a dam. From his vantage, Pompey saw his banners fall one by one, trampled into the dust by his own fleeing soldiers. The eagle of his legion, once lifted in triumph across continents, vanished beneath a wave of blood and smoke. In that moment something inside him fractured. He had believed, truly believed, that the gods would favor the lawful, that Rome would remember her savior, that destiny would bend to discipline. But standing amid the ruin of his army, Pompey realized the truth. Rome no longer belonged to him. It no longer belonged to anyone. It was a beast that had turned on its masters. The noise around him faded, the clashing steel, the screams, the thunder of retreat, all dimmed to a dull hum. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and ragged. The taste of dust filled his mouth. He looked to the horizon and saw the impossible. Caesar's red cloak, still advancing through the haze, his men silent, methodical, unstoppable. It was not rage that filled Pompey then. Not even fear. It was the hollow understanding that history was moving on without him. The once great general turned his horse. He said nothing to his officers. No rallying cry, no defiance. Just a quiet order: withdraw. Behind him his army broke completely. The field became a sea of fleeing men, their armor glinting like scattered stars before being swallowed by the dust. Pompey rode until he could no longer hear the sounds of battle, only the slow rhythm of his horse's breath and the whisper of the wind across the plain. When he finally stopped, he turned once more to look back. The smoke still rose. The vultures had already begun to circle. And there, somewhere beneath that swirling cloud of ruin, lay the corpse of the republic he had once sworn to protect. He said nothing. Because what could be said when a man outlives his own greatness? The world he had conquered was gone. The Senate that had exalted him now cowered in fear of his rival. The people who had once cheered his name had chosen another. And in that silence he understood, not all defeats are marked by death. Some are marked by survival. Pompey rode toward the sea that day, not as a conqueror, but as a ghost of his own making. His armor still gleamed, but it no longer felt like protection, only weight. He thought Rome would remember his victories. It remembered only his failure. If you can watch the rise and fall of a man who built empires and feel nothing, then perhaps you too have forgotten what loyalty costs. Subscribe to Tale of History, or remain silent with the rest who watched heroes fall. The night after Pharsalus was not a night at all, it was a void. The battlefield behind him still burned, faintly glowing in the distance like the dying heart of an empire. The cries of the wounded drifted across the plain and into the sea winds that carried Pompey the Great away from everything he had ever known. His ship rocked beneath a bruised sky as lightning tore through the clouds, flashing across the water in shards of silver and flame. The sea boiled with the fury of the storm, waves rose like mountains, crashing against the hull with the sound of drums from some ancient god's revenge. Rain lashed the deck, cold and punishing, washing blood and dirt from armor that no longer gleamed. Pompey stood near the prow, his cloak soaked and clinging, his once immaculate face hollowed by exhaustion and disbelief. His sword hung at his side, but it felt meaningless now, a relic of a glory that the sea no longer recognized. Beside him, Cornelia wept silently. She had followed him through triumphs and processions, through the marble palaces of Rome and the golden cities of the East. But she had never seen him like this, not the man who conquered, not the hero who was worshipped, but a shadow of that man, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though he could will the past back from the waves. Her hands trembled as she clutched the rail. Every crash of thunder seemed to mock their prayers. Every flash of lightning illuminated the faces of the oarsmen, drenched, terrified, glancing at Pompey as though the gods themselves had abandoned him. And perhaps they had. The sea, once his ally, the same sea he had tamed from pirates and chaos, now rose against him in rebellion. It had been his empire, his pathway to immortality. But now it was his confessional, an endless, black expanse where he could no longer hide from the truth. He had fled not just a battle but judgment. As the ship pitched and rolled, Pompey gripped the mast and turned his face toward the fading shore of Greece. The lightning illuminated it for a heartbeat, the dark outline of hills, the ruins of his camp, the smoke curling up like the ghosts of fallen legions. He was leaving behind not just soldiers but a lifetime. Every victory, every laurel, every oath sworn in his name, all swallowed by that same stretch of earth that had once glorified him. He closed his eyes, but he could still see them, the faces of men who had believed he could not lose. The soldiers who had marched across continents under his banner. The Senate that had called him Rome's shield. The wife who had smiled when he promised that Rome would never fall. And yet it had. Not in ruins but in spirit. Cornelia reached for him, her voice trembling against the roar of the wind. "Where will we go?" Pompey did not answer. He had no plan, no map, no command left to give. All his life, he had moved with purpose, from war to triumph, from conquest to coronation. Now the sea stretched before him, vast and indifferent, offering only exile. He thought of Caesar, still on the mainland, his red cloak bright against the ashes of Pharsalus. The man he had once called friend. The man who had outlived the Republic by becoming what the Republic feared most. And for the first time, Pompey understood, power does not belong to the virtuous. It belongs to those willing to stain their souls to keep it. Lightning flashed again, reflecting off his armor. For a moment, it made him look like the man he had been, invincible, unbroken. But the illusion vanished as quickly as it came, swallowed by darkness and rain. The wind howled through the rigging like the voices of the dead. He heard his past in it, the cheers of the crowds that once filled Rome, the chants of Magnus, Magnus, that had echoed through triumphal arches and marble halls. Now those voices returned only as mockery, rising and falling with the waves. The ship's captain shouted orders, his voice ragged against the storm. The oarsmen pulled harder, their muscles straining, their faces lit by flashes of lightning. But even they could feel it, that this was no ordinary storm. It was the reckoning of a world Pompey had tried to command. As the hours dragged into night, the storm began to ease, leaving behind only the sound of the waves, slower now, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Pompey leaned against the railing, his fingers gripping the wet wood, his reflection trembling in the dark water below. He no longer saw a general. He saw a man stripped bare, a man who had chased greatness only to find that greatness devours all who touch it. The sea mirrored him perfectly, vast, cold, and merciless. Cornelia whispered his name, but he didn't turn. He was somewhere else now, in memory, in regret. He thought of the moment years ago when he had stood at the height of his power, gazing down from the steps of his theater in Rome, the city shouting his name as if he were a god. He wondered if the gods had laughed that day. The sea stretched endlessly ahead, a road with no promise of return. Pompey knew he could never go back, not to Rome, not to the Republic, not to the man he once was. The world he had built had moved on without him. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, though even he no longer believed it would be heard. The wind carried his words away before they reached the stars. Every conqueror, in the end, becomes the conquered, not by armies but by time, by pride, by the silence that follows when the cheering stops. The storm subsided. The ship drifted onward through the black waters, the oars dipping softly in rhythm with the sea's slow, eternal sigh. Pompey lifted his gaze one last time toward the horizon. No stars. No gods. Only darkness. He had ruled the world once. Now the world ruled him. He thought the sea would save him. It would only deliver him to his fate. If you can still watch the waves swallow the last light of a man's greatness and feel nothing, then perhaps you've forgotten how easily time drowns the mighty. Subscribe to Tale of History, before the tide erases every name you think will last forever. The dawn that broke over the coast of Pelusium was beautiful, unnaturally so. The waters were still, the sands pale as bone, the horizon painted with gold. The storm that had followed Pompey from Greece was gone, replaced by a silence so perfect it felt rehearsed. The sea that had raged like a god now lay calm as if watching, waiting. Pompey stood at the bow of his ship, his cloak stiff with salt and wind, the faint light of morning touching the weary lines of his face. Before him stretched the land that had once known Alexander the Great, the same land where the gods of conquest and betrayal had always walked hand in hand. He believed, or perhaps forced himself to believe, that here on the edge of Egypt he would find refuge. Egypt had been an ally of Rome once. He had sheltered their kings, defended their borders, sent Rome's armies to secure their throne. He had saved their dynasty. Surely he thought that debt still lived. But debts mean nothing to the frightened. Beyond the shoreline, in a low palace tented with silk and shadow, 3 men whispered while a boy listened. The boy was Ptolemy XIII, king by name, pawn by design. Barely 13 years old, his crown too heavy for his small, unsteady head. Around him, his counselors moved like serpents through the scent of myrrh and sea breeze. Theodotus, the philosopher, whose wisdom had curdled into cunning. Achillas, the general, whose loyalty had been bought 100 times over. Pothinus, the regent, whose ambition burned brighter than any torch. Together they spoke softly as though conspiring with the air itself. Pompey comes, Pothinus said, his voice cold. The Romans are at war. Caesar is the victor. Shall Egypt tie its name to the defeated? He was once the greatest man alive, Theodotus murmured, eyes gleaming. A god among Romans. But gods fall, and men must choose whom to worship next. Achillas leaned forward, his hand resting on his sword. If we welcome him, Caesar will see weakness. If we kill him, Caesar will see loyalty. The boy king said nothing. His fingers toyed with a golden ring, his expression vacant, the expression of a child too young to understand that power demands blood as proof. Theodotus smiled faintly, his words sliding through the chamber like a blade hidden in silk. Kill him, he whispered, and please Caesar. And with those words the last door closed. The trap was set, not with swords but with promises. Outside, on the tranquil coast, the Egyptian envoys were already preparing a small boat. Their faces were smooth, unreadable. They spoke gently, their gestures deferential. They told Pompey the king awaited him inland, that the court was eager to receive its Roman friend. The word friend echoed strangely in the air. Pompey's officers hesitated. Some begged him not to go. The coastline looked wrong, too quiet, too deliberate. No royal banners, no guards in parade. Only a few figures in light linen, and behind them the endless silence of sand. But Pompey, weary of exile, of suspicion, of running, wanted to believe. He wanted to believe that the world still had honor left in it. Cornelia watched from the deck, her hand trembling against the rail. She felt the chill before he did, the way the waves lapped too gently, the way the Egyptians bowed too low. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Don't go." He turned to her, his eyes softer now, not the eyes of a general, but of a man exhausted by the cruelty of survival. "It will be fine," he said. "They owe me peace." The words sounded hollow even to him. He stepped into the small boat. The oars dipped silently into the clear water. The Egyptian soldiers rowed without speaking, their faces blank under the sun. Pompey sat at the center, staring toward the shore that seemed to recede even as they approached it. The sea glittered, mocking him with its beauty. The same sea that had once carried his triumphs now carried him toward betrayal. He thought of Rome, of the Senate halls that had echoed with his name, of the streets that had cheered his return. He thought of Caesar, whose ambition had devoured the Republic. He thought of the gods, silent and distant. But he did not think of death. Not yet. The coast of Egypt drew closer. Palms swayed in the light wind. A handful of soldiers waited at the water's edge. Behind them stood Achilles, sword at his side, the faintest smile curling his lips. Pompey rose slightly, adjusting his cloak as if preparing for ceremony. He reached for his hand of greeting, the gesture of diplomacy, of peace, the same gesture that had ended wars and crowned kings. But on that morning it was only a signal. The oars slowed. The boat scraped against the sand. Pompey stepped forward, the sunlight flashing on the bronze of his armor, the armor of Rome's last great general, now dulled by salt and exile. The Egyptian soldiers bowed. Their shadows fell long across the shore. And the air went still. He believed, for one fleeting instant, that it was over, that the wandering had ended, that he had finally reached safety. He did not see the dagger beneath the folds of linen, nor the look that passed between Achilles and his men. He saw only what he wanted to see, the calm, the order, the illusion of welcome. And above them all, the sky burned gold and blue, as if the gods themselves refused to blink. History holds its breath in such moments, when a man who once ruled the world mistakes silence for mercy. He had walked through wars, crossed continents, faced armies, but nothing, not even Pharsalus, would be as cruel as what awaited him on these tranquil shores. The sea that had been his confessional now became his witness. If you can watch a man step willingly into his own betrayal and still believe in loyalty, then you've never seen how softly history kills its heroes. Subscribe to Tale of History, and remember, not every death is loud. Some arrive disguised as welcome. September 28, 48 BC. The morning was too still. The kind of stillness that comes before something unspeakable. The Mediterranean lay flat as glass, its surface reflecting a sky too blue to be trusted. Not a wave broke. Not a gull cried. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Pompey stood upon the deck of his ship, his armor cleaned, his cloak fastened. The years had turned his victories into ghosts, but this morning he carried himself as though those ghosts still saluted him. His hair, once golden, was streaked with white now. His face bore the fatigue of every war he'd fought, and lost. Yet beneath the exhaustion, there was still the trace of that man Rome once called Magnus. The Egyptian skiff approached, a narrow wooden craft, simple, unadorned, its hull worn by tide and time. Achilles stood at its bow, his eyes fixed forward. Beside him, another man waited, his face half hidden beneath a Roman hood. His name was Lucius Septimius, a mercenary now in Egyptian service, once a centurion under Pompey's command. When Pompey recognized him, something in his gaze softened. "Ah," he said quietly, "one of my own." The irony was lost on no one. Cornelia stood beside him on the deck of the Roman galley, her hand pressed against her lips, her eyes wide with unspoken dread. The sea between them and the Egyptian skiff felt infinite, not in distance but in fate. A sailor lowered a ladder. Pompey placed one hand on the railing, the other over his heart as if steadying it. He turned to his wife one last time. "Whatever happens," he told her softly, "remember, I have lived as Rome's servant." He descended the ladder slowly, his armor glinting faintly under the pale sun. When his feet touched the skiff, the wood creaked. Septimius bowed slightly, not in respect but in rehearsal. The Egyptians rowed. The oars dipped in perfect rhythm, slicing through the still water with the whisper of a blade drawn in darkness. Each stroke carried them farther from the Roman ship, farther from safety, farther into the silence that seemed to thicken with every yard. Pompey sat near the center, his back straight, his eyes scanning the Egyptian shore ahead. The coastline shimmered in the haze, a line of gold and white sand, peaceful, empty, indifferent. He tried to speak, polite, diplomatic words, the kind that had once moved kings and councils alike, but none came. The men around him were stone. Their faces gave nothing. Only the sound of the oars remained. Dip, pull, breathe, dip, pull, breathe. The rhythm of execution. A gull circled overhead, crying once, its shadow flickering across Pompey's face. He looked up, perhaps searching for an omen, perhaps for forgiveness, and for a moment the sun caught his eyes and he looked almost young again. Septimius shifted slightly. Achilles gave a faint nod. Pompey never saw the blade drawn. It came quietly, sliding between ribs worn by command, cutting through cloth and memory alike. A Roman dagger, the same kind he had once bestowed upon his soldiers as a mark of loyalty. Septimius drove it into his back with the strength of a man killing his past. Pompey gasped, not in fear, not even in pain, but in disbelief. The sound that left his mouth was not a cry, but a breath stolen halfway between question and realization. His body lurched forward, hands clutching the edge of the boat, eyes wide in shock. For a heartbeat he tried to rise, to turn, to speak, to command, but the strength was gone. The dagger twisted once, mercilessly, and then withdrew. He fell silently, his blood spilling into the wood and over the side, darkening the water. The sea that had carried him to empires now received him like a grave. From the Roman ship anchored offshore, Cornelia's scream broke the stillness, a sound that cut across the waves and through the hearts of every man who heard it. She reached out, her voice cracking against the horizon, but the skiff did not turn. The Egyptians said nothing. The red spread quickly, swirling beneath the oars. The sea itself seemed to recoil. Pompey's body lay motionless, his face turned toward the sky. The sun shone on him one last time, the same sun that had once risen over his triumphs in Rome, his victories in Asia, his parades through marble streets. Now it bore witness to the end of its favorite sun. Achilles gave a quiet order. The oars resumed. Dip, pull, breathe, dip, pull, breathe. The skiff moved away from the stain it had made, the waves closing over it as if history were already trying to hide its shame. On the Roman galley, Cornelia collapsed to her knees, her voice a whisper drowned by the wind. The sailors stood frozen, their eyes on the distant shore, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they had just witnessed the murder of Rome's last great man. The sea, his final battlefield, was silent again. And yet, in that silence you can almost hear his thoughts as they fade into the deep. Was this how Rome thanked her servants? Was this how loyalty ends? He had trusted that honor still meant something in the world he helped build. He had believed that the name Pompey Magnus still carried weight among men. But loyalty, like power, is only sacred until it becomes inconvenient. The sea turned red. The gulls scattered. The skiff drifted toward the Egyptian shore carrying not a conqueror, but an offering. He trusted loyalty. It answered with steel. If you think betrayal belongs to the past, you've forgotten how history breathes. Subscribe to Tale of History, where every empire's last breath is remembered before silence takes it again. When the deed was done, the assassins did not leave him to the sea. The Egyptians, pragmatic in cruelty, believed that a corpse could still serve a purpose. Even in death, Pompey the Great could be used to purchase favor. They severed his head upon the shore, the knife sawing through the neck that had once carried the weight of Rome's commands. The salt wind carried the sound away, mingling with the hush of waves retreating from the sand. His body was left behind, stripped, bloodied, forgotten, while his head was placed inside a clay jar, its coarse surface still warm from the sun. They said it was a gift, a token of loyalty, an offering to Caesar. Days later, under the same merciless sun, Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. Victor of Pharsalus, ruler of Rome in all but name, the man whose ambition had undone the republic itself. He came to Alexandria expecting diplomacy, perhaps resistance. Instead, he was met on the docks by Egyptian envoys bearing a strange, covered vessel. They bowed low before him, smiling the way men smile when they hope fear looks like reverence. "My lord," said Pothinus, the regent, "Egypt greets the conqueror of the world. We bring you peace, and a gift worthy of Caesar." Caesar motioned for the jar to be brought forward. The attendants hesitated, then removed the covering. What lay within was not peace. The head of Pompey the Great, preserved in salt and oil, stared up at him through half-closed eyes. The face that had once commanded legions now looked waxen and gray. The lips, once the voice of the Senate, were stiff and broken. The beard was matted with blood, and sand clung to the wound where the blade had entered. For a long moment Caesar said nothing. The air around him thickened with silence. His officers looked away. The Egyptians shifted, uncertain whether to smile or to bow again. Caesar stepped forward. His hand trembled as he reached toward the jar, then stopped, fingers hovering just above the rim. His voice when it came was barely a whisper. "This was Pompey?" No one answered. The conqueror's eyes fixed upon the face of the man who had once been his hero, his rival, his mirror. He remembered the first time he had seen him, tall, confident, adored by Rome. He had envied him then, studied him, learned from him. And now here he was, reduced to a relic of flesh and salt. Caesar turned away. His throat tightened. The officers who had followed him through 10 years of war had never seen him weep, but now the tears came. They slid down his cheeks silently, unnoticed at first, until his voice broke through the stillness. "You have murdered greatness," he said. "You have shamed victory." The Egyptians froze, confused. They had expected triumph. They had expected a smile, perhaps even gratitude. They had not expected grief. For Caesar understood what they could not, that the death of Pompey was not the death of an enemy, but the death of an age. The Republic had died with him, not on the battlefield but here on a foreign shore, reduced to an object in a jar. He ordered the envoys away, his tone sharp with disgust. "Take it," he said, "and bury it with honor." He was a Roman. They obeyed. For even in death the weight of that word, Roman, still commanded obedience. That night, Caesar stood alone by the shore where Pompey had fallen. The waves rolled softly as if whispering confessions to the sand. Somewhere beyond the darkness, the body of the man he had once admired was being burned in secret by a lone soldier, a stranger who had followed the corpse out of pity, lighting a small pyre from driftwood and broken oars. The flames flickered against the black horizon, fragile and defiant. Caesar watched in silence. He had won everything, the war, the power, the empire. Yet as the fire faded, he felt the cold truth pressing against him. Even conquest cannot resurrect honor. Pompey's head had been a trophy meant to please a victor, but all it had done was expose the rot beneath the idea of victory itself. The man who had ruled the seas, who had brought order to the world, now existed only as a severed memory. History does not remember who gave the order, who held the knife, who carried the jar. It remembers only that once, the greatest man in Rome died nameless on foreign sand. Even the conquerors cannot command dignity for the dead. And as Caesar turned away from the shore, the wind carried a single whisper, or perhaps only guilt taking shape in his thoughts. "Is this what greatness becomes?" He did not answer. No one ever does. The torchlight flickered, the sea sighed, and the world moved on. He had gained the world. But Rome had lost its soul. If you can stand before the fall of giants and still believe that power redeems itself, then perhaps you've never looked into the eyes of victory and seen its shame. When the flames had died, when the sea had carried away its crimson stain, there remained nothing of Pompey the Great but fragments, the ash of a man who had once commanded half the known world. His name still lingered on the tongues of men, but his body was gone. What was left of him was gathered by trembling hands, the loyal few who had not fled when the gods abandoned him. They brought what they could to Cornelia, his wife, who waited on a lonely stretch of sand not far from Pelusium. The dawn was gray that morning, the horizon veiled by a mist that blurred sea from sky. The waves rolled in slow and heavy, carrying the smell of salt and smoke, the scent of endings. She stood alone. The soldiers and servants dared not speak to her. The woman who had once been the wife of a general, the envy of Rome's matrons, now looked like a figure carved from grief itself. Her hair loose, her robe torn, her eyes fixed on the small urn before her. Inside it, what remained of Magnus the Great. They had told her what had been done, how he was struck down in a skiff like a criminal, how his body was desecrated, how the Egyptians had cut him apart as though he were no more than a commodity to be exchanged for favor. But the woman said nothing. No wail escaped her lips. No curse. No plea to the heavens. She merely knelt beside the urn and touched its cold surface, tracing it with her fingertips as if she could still feel the heartbeat that once commanded armies. The wind rose, lifting the veil from her shoulders. It moved through the ruins of the camp like a whisper, the voice of memory itself. Around her, a few of Pompey's most faithful, freedmen, slaves, veterans who had survived Pharsalus, gathered in silence. They had followed him through every battle and now they followed him into death. One of them, an old centurion with scars deep as years, stepped forward. His voice was hoarse, cracked by salt and loyalty. "He had no tomb," he said. "So the sea will keep him." Cornelia looked up. For the first time, her eyes shone not with tears, but with the clarity of something older than sorrow. "He was the sea," she whispered. And so they prepared the last rites. There was no priest, no marble altar, no Senate decree. Only a handful of men who had once shouted his name on the battlefields of the East, now kneeling in the sand, their hands trembling as they poured the ashes into the wind. The tide came in slowly, touching their feet, carrying the remnants of Pompey back into the vastness that had once made him immortal. The urn emptied. The wind rose. The ash lifted, a gray veil dissolving into the blue. Cornelia watched it scatter, her hands clasped before her chest, her lips moving in a prayer too quiet to hear. It was not the prayer of a Roman, nor of a queen. It was the plea of a woman who had loved a man made of ambition, now reduced to dust. The sea accepted him gently as if it had been waiting. Each wave that broke upon the shore seemed to bow, each gust of wind carried his name further into eternity. Pompey had built empires, commanded kings, reshaped the world, but in the end his kingdom was no more than this, a handful of ash scattered to the elements. His banners had fallen, his legions dispersed, his glory dissolved into myth. Cornelia did not weep. She could not. Grief had transformed into something deeper, into memory, into legend. She built no tomb for him. She commissioned no marble statue, no inscription. She understood that marble crumbles, that stone erodes, but that memory, whispered, mourned, retold, is harder to bury. The men who had served him swore oaths over the sea that day. They promised to keep his story alive, to speak his name where others feared to remind the world that once there was a man who rose higher than any mortal should. Night came softly over the water, the stars flickering above like candles over an unmarked grave. Cornelia lingered until the last light had gone, the waves lapping at her feet, the urn empty beside her. In that quiet, she spoke one final truth to the darkness. Rome forgot how to love its heroes. And then she turned and walked away, her figure fading into the mist, leaving behind only the sound of the tide and the ghost of a name that refused to die. The wind carried it, Pompeius Magnus, over the sea he once ruled, into the endless horizon where memory and oblivion meet. Every empire ends in dust. Every name an echo. And when the waves return to claim us all, only the stories remain. Subscribe to Tale of History, or stand silent among the ruins. The sea that took Pompey's ashes returned to silence, but Rome did not. Empires rarely grieve, they rot. In the months that followed his death, the heart of the Republic beat slower, heavier, as though mourning something it could not name. In its marble halls, men still spoke of victory, of law, of destiny, but behind their voices lingered an absence. For with Pompey's fall, something greater than a man had been extinguished. The soul of the Republic had died with him. Far away, Julius Caesar stood at the edge of Egypt's harbor, staring into the same waters that had swallowed his rival. The wind carried the scent of salt and decay, the same scent that had hung over Pharsalus. The waves whispered as if mocking him, "You won." But victory had never felt so hollow. He had pursued Pompey across continents, crushed his legions, torn his legacy apart, all to stand here alone with nothing but the echo of a dead man's name. For all his conquests, Caesar could not escape the weight of what he had destroyed. In the silence between battles, he began to understand that triumph and tragedy are written in the same language. Rome had crowned him its master, but in doing so, it had stripped itself bare. The Senate that once stood as the spine of the Republic now bowed in trembling obedience. The people, once citizens, had become spectators. And the city itself, that restless, burning heart of empire, had grown quiet as if waiting for something it no longer believed in. The gods were gone from the temples. The forum no longer thundered with debate. The marble pillars that once shook with the voices of men now held only ghosts. And among those ghosts, one name refused to rest, Pompeius Magnus. In the quiet corners of the Curia, senators still whispered it. Not in loyalty but in fear. The name had become a warning, a reminder that Rome devoured even its greatest. In their dreams, some claimed they saw him walking the streets again, cloaked in mist, his face half lit by torchlight, his eyes empty and knowing. The ghost of Rome, wandering through what remained of its conscience. Caesar himself could not escape him. When he closed his eyes, he saw again the jar, the severed head, the lifeless gaze. He saw the moment when triumph became guilt. He had not killed Pompey's body, but he had killed his world. And for that there could be no pardon. The irony, of course, was cruel, as it always is. For the blade that struck Pompey was only the first. The same Senate Pompey had defended, the same marble hall where he had once spoken of virtue, duty, and law, would, not long after, draw knives against Caesar himself. The circle of betrayal, perfect and complete. The men who had cheered Caesar's name would stab it into the marble with every thrust. And when the blood pooled at the foot of the Curia steps, when Caesar gasped his final words to the friend who betrayed him, Rome would once again prove that no victory lasts long enough to silence guilt. The Republic, long dead, would finally be buried. Its ideals, its honor, its balance, all reduced to whispers under the weight of empire. Pompey had died believing he was defending the Republic. Caesar would die believing he had restored it. Both were wrong. Both had been consumed by the same beast, the hunger that drives men to outshine gods, only to become ghosts themselves. History, ever patient, began its cycle anew. Every generation of Rome would inherit the same curse. The belief that they could control power, that they could wield it without becoming its servant. But power does not die. It only reincarnates, in betrayal, in ambition, in the silence that follows every fallen hero. The ghost of Pompey would linger through the centuries, not as a man but as a mirror. In every emperor's shadow, in every dictator's fear, in every empire that rose from blood and fell to pride, his memory would breathe again. For Rome never truly buried its dead. It built upon them. Caesar's triumphs would turn to tyranny. Brutus would call his murder justice. Octavian would call it peace. And each would believe that their Rome was eternal, until time, patient and merciless, proved them wrong. The ashes of Pompey had long since scattered into the sea. Yet every wave that touched Rome's shores carried a trace of him, the salt of pride, the taste of defeat, the memory of a man who once believed he could hold the world and still keep his soul. In the end, Rome did not die with fire. It died with forgetting. And Pompey's ghost, the ghost of virtue, of lost honor, of a republic too proud to save itself, would drift forever through the ruins, whispering a single question to those who followed. What is left of greatness when greatness forgets its limits? Every empire must answer. Every empire must fall. Because power does not die, it is reborn through betrayal. And history, in its cruel devotion, never runs out of men to destroy. If you can still watch the world's ghosts repeat their cycle and believe your own age will be different, you have already joined them. The sea is quiet again. No banners flutter, no oars break the surface, no voices call out across the wind. Only the waves remain, patient, indifferent, eternal. They roll onto the same Egyptian shore where a great man once fell, and retreat again, washing away every trace of his passage. The camera of the mind drifts slowly over that coast, Pelusium, desolate, wind-scoured, stripped of witness. The sand has forgotten the blood that darkened it, the cries that once split its silence. Footprints fade almost as soon as they appear, dissolved by the same tide that carried Pompey the Great into history's deep water. There is no monument here. No marble inscription. No statue of bronze to hold his likeness against the wind. Only the rhythm of the waves, the slow erasure of legacy. Centuries pass. Empires rise, crumble, and rebuild upon the bones of older ones. Yet the question persists, echoing across time like a ghost that refuses to die. Who was Pompey? To some, he was a hero, the man who saved Rome from anarchy, who crushed piracy, who restored order to a fractured world. The Republic's guardian. The living symbol of Roman virtue. To others, he was a coward, a man who fled from the fate he had built with his own hands, who mistook caution for honor, and surrendered his destiny to the tides. And to still others, he was a fool, blinded by pride, betrayed by his own illusions, believing that the same world which worshipped him would not one day demand his head as a trophy. Every historian who speaks his name builds a different Pompey, warrior, statesman, failure, martyr. But the truth, as always, lies buried somewhere between glory and regret. He was all of them, and none of them. He was Rome itself, its brilliance, its arrogance, its endless hunger for power dressed as virtue. The Republic had mirrored him, and when he died, it saw its reflection crumble. The waves lap closer now, their foam ghost-white in the dim light of a fading sun. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echoes, the tramp of legions, the roar of crowds, the clash of ambition against destiny. All swallowed, all silenced. His name once commanded the loyalty of nations. Now it drifts like dust in forgotten scrolls, surviving only in the mouths of those who tell his story. The syllables are softer now, worn down by centuries, almost tender. Pompeius Magnus. Magnus, the Great. How fragile that word sounds now. How easily it slips between the fingers, like the sand that bears his memory. The scholars will keep debating. The books will keep retelling. The world will keep forgetting. And somewhere on this nameless shore, the wind will keep tracing invisible letters in the sand, only for the next wave to erase them again. Because that is how all greatness ends, not with thunder, not with fire, but with absence. The waves smooth the earth. The past fades. And time, cold, impartial time, closes its hand over everything it once applauded. He built an empire upon loyalty. He died discovering that loyalty is sand. And as the final wave draws back, leaving the shore bare once more, only one truth remains. He was called Magnus, the Great, yet even greatness drowns when memory looks away. Don't look away. Subscribe to Tale of History, and keep the dead remembered.